José María, muchísimas gracias por tus palabras, bienvenidos a todos y para mí realmente es un honor hacer esta introducción que si ustedes me lo permiten la voy a hacer en inglés. It's a great honor for me to introduce one of the relevant figures of the World Bank in the field of research. I'm talking about Daria Taglioni. Daria Taglioni is Research Manager, Trade and International Integration Development Research Group. She joined the World Bank Group in 2011 as Senior Trade Economist in the International Trade Department of the Poverty Reduction of Economy Management Network. Since then, she has held various positions and roles, including 10 task lead for the World Development Report in 2020, principal economist in the International Finance Corporation, and World Bank Global Leads of Global Value Chains. Previously, she worked as senior economist at the European Central Bank and as economist at the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. She has published in the American Economy Review, Journal of International Economics, and other scholarly journals. Her work has been featured in international media outlets such as the New York Times and Forbes. She authored various books on international trade. She's Italian and holds a PhD in international economics for the Graduate Institute in Geneva. We there have a magnificent opportunity to learn from a person with extensive experience in international institutions, in the European Central Bank, in the World Bank, for example. Well, let me tell you that Daria immediately accepted our offer to be the keynote speaker for this opening session and that she was given us all kinds of facilities regarding the subject matter, the duration of the opening lecture, and we are very grateful for her to that. And now, without further delay, I give the floor to Daria to give the opening lecture for this conference. 5 years into the reversal in openness, lesson and new question. Daria, welcome to this meeting and thank you for being here with us.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. But in English, I'm Italian, but still, I don't think I would be able to do a presentation in Italian of this topic, so I don't. Okay, so while we are presenting that, I can start basically. And what I was going to present and show some slides is a smartphone. I wanted to start with this before we talk about the global economy. Why? Because this is the poster child of globalization. So I spent a few years now trying to put out a paper with some colleagues from different fields on what is as a result of as a result of the frontier technologies that are available on a global scale. So the first thing I would have shown you is that if you look at the increase in capability since the first smartphone, here it is. So the increase in capability, we can go. We had it. Okay, the increasing capability of the smartphone since the first smartphone was created in 2008 2009 on every single aspects from memory, battery, computational capacity, it's astounding. Do we get it? We have it? Okay, perfecto. Okay, let me come here. We don't have the. It's okay. I'll just do that. Okay. Okay. So I'm into the premise. It's okay. Don't worry. Thanks. Okay. So that was the smartphone. So this is the increasing capabilities, and as you see, These are the main functions of the smartphone: the CPU, the memory, the display, the camera, the battery, the connectivity, and then others. And if you look within each of those, then there are other particular aspects. Here we try to list the most important. And this is the average annual growth rate from in the period since the smartphone exists. And this it means that every year some of the capabilities, I don't know, for instance, the scale is the biggest, but the main memory, it increased by 40% every year, right? So how was this possible? Globalization has a lot to do with that. And let me come here so I see also the slides. Okay. So what we did was to take all a database we created, which is normally done for the benefit of engineers. It is basically when a new phone comes out, there are some people that literally tear apart the phones and catalog every single piece and information they can gather on every single piece. And that is basically done for the competitors to find out what are the improvements of the latest phone, or for complementary producers to actually develop their complementary technology or services. And so basically the information that we have from this data set also gives us a lot of insight on who are actually the companies producing around that. And so what we found over this period of time where there was that increase in technology is that the average number of components has grown exponentially from, this is what in the American English they call the dumb phone, meaning the Nokia, basically. And here is the smartphone, right? So already was a jump, but a smartphone was 200 components versus 100 of a Nokia, so double the complexity. And from there on, it kept increasing. And in 2020, which is when we stopped gathering this data, we were at 500 components and increasingly small. That's a lot of technology capability that you have to put into that. At the same time, we started counting the numbers of suppliers, of individual suppliers that contribute to do that product increased. And increased the number from which they were coming. It's still not so many, but it went from 4 countries, suppliers from 4 countries, to suppliers from 6 to 7 countries. So how was this possible? So what we do in this paper is to put out this concept of massive modularity. And we say that the smartphone industry has embraced this modularity, which is basically a very democratic system of producing. There is not a hierarchy. It's not anymore like a large corporation that tells its suppliers what to do. A different industry that is equally important, but more an industry of the past, is very hierarchical. That's the automotive industry, right? The smartphone is very different. The digital technologies are very different. But interestingly, that complexity and that decentralization is increasingly affecting a lot of frontier technologies. What we don't know is whether it's the digital technology and how it is organized, and also the open source setup of this that allows to do that, or it's simply that very sophisticated, modern, complex goods require a lot of people to agree on things, require a lot of non-codified information, and in order to transmit this non-codified information, you need a fundamentally democratic system where everybody can bring its best. Basically, I like to say that in these modern products, one has to think really as a biking team, a bicycle team. We all know the name of the guy that will get the maillot jaune, given that we are at Tour de France time. but behind him there is an entire team of people that nobody knows the names of, but they have to be the top of the game, and that they're happy, content. They don't need global fame. What they need is to know that they're doing their work at the best, right? So a lot of these modern technologies, and in particular these digital technologies, are very much like that. So what does it mean? That there are plenty, these 500 companies specialized in many different fields, and innovation happens at the margins of that technology. So there are new technologies that are brought in with the core one. And so what drives innovation is specialization. Specialization was possible because of globalization. So that's why I'm making this long introduction. So this is how a smartphone looks if one wants to, to think of this modularity. So there are all these interfaces within the industry, the blue, and then the yellow one are two industries that are integrated. Like all the appliances are TOM, or any other products that you connect, that you want to do things and you use your smartphone to control it as a control console, or products and services that you again consume or contribute to produce through platforms intermediated by this technology. And so at the center of this, there is this distributed ecosystem. So the iOS or Android are such distributed ecosystem. But for instance, ChatGPT is becoming a distributed ecosystem, right? I mean, if you go on ChatGPT, it starts giving you apps just like the Android or iOS system, right? There is this idea of co-production in this fundamentally democratic space. And so actually one thing that I would like to reflecting on, it's also this role of this democratic space where everybody can basically express and contribute to the technology while we go along, because it has to do again with globalization. And so all this system is what creates this powerful network effects. We saw it yesterday in Julia's presentation, no? We were using technologies from at least 20, 30 companies just really to consume that one lessons, right? And there is no way that her company can do them all in-house. They just do a very tiny, teeny part on which they are top of the game, and the rest, they go into this ecosystem and they integrate it in. And that is what allows them to become top of the game. They can specialize and they can rely on all this ecosystem for all these complements that they need. And so what we looked at is like, okay, let's go then in each of these little tiny, teeny parts and ask whether there are more or less companies over time doing each and every product. And what we found is that it's an incredible consolidation, even compared to 5-6 years ago. But this is not because of the current globalization. It has been really the trend, longer trend. So if 5-6 years ago there were like 5 companies that were main global producers of memory, towards the end, there were 1 or 2 of our data set. And so the dotted line is what in the US they consider a too concentrated market. There is the Department of Justice that says that that's the threshold, this Hirschman-Erfindel index of concentration. If it's above 0.25, it's a market that is too concentrated. And what this figure tells us is that every single product in a smartphone is today too concentrated, right? And even collection of And so on the one hand, we have fragmentation because we have more companies from more countries producing together that in this very distributed way. But within each component, we have one company, two companies. And this is really the tension that is bringing a lot of reflection about where we are going, because you have more opportunities and more people you need to work with from all over the world, but you are dependent more and more for doing complex things from one producer or two producers that you don't even know who is and where is located, right? And so that's something that makes policymakers really worried. And in the US, they now openly speak about a problem of national security. They say that this intersection between technology, national security, and trade is going to be at the heart of a lot of what will be decided in the next 10 years, right? So here, basically, I was saying, okay, basically, the smartphone is dominated by companies that you know the names of, Apple, Samsung, and Huawei. But behind there are all these other giants that you don't know. Whoever heard of Murata, for instance? Murata is basically the market monopolist of some of the components that allow each of them to function. Then, of course, there is also an economy that is more traditional, right? And you don't need to go to less technology-intensive sectors to find this more traditional way of working. So, for instance, the lower-end phones, the simpler phones, they're actually much more fragmented, and they respond more to what we learned from economics. These ones don't, and we need, indeed, I think what is being done here, quantitative analysis, but then this quantitative analysis needs to be brought to the modelers that need to come with new frameworks, and there has to be this back and forth, right? So that's where we are. Okay, this was, I sort of described it already, but this was basically, we were trying to map out where, the flows of every and each part in the smartphone in 2012 and then in 2017. And if you see the network becomes more concentrated, more sparse. So there is geographic clustering. Each function started, so basically I was doing memory, all the other large corporations doing memory would locate in my same place because we had network effects and it was more efficient. And that brought to what we hear a lot, more dependency, more interdependency, more exposure to foreign imported shocks, more risk, no? Because basically these links between pair of countries became less but thicker. And so if they break, it hurts more, right? And this is the companies, the countries that are market leaders in this product. And so there are these global value chains with stages of production across primarily China, US, South Korea, and Taiwan. Final assembly is concentrated in China. But the key components until now were from the US, South Korea, and Taiwan. Now, what's happening, it's not part of the talk, but an interesting new phenomenon is that as the US and China are putting a lot of barriers on each other, actually, and the US is doing it to slow down the ability of China to get into new areas of this type of technologies, actually what is obtaining for now is the opposite, because basically by shutting this global ecosystem to Chinese companies of complementary products, it's obliging them to buy from Chinese counterparts. And so for the first time, we see investment and increase in capital goods in China, when China's been trying to invest a lot of money for 40 years to actually do that, but was stuck at this final assembly. Because basically even the Chinese companies like Huawei, they wouldn't go for their core components to other Chinese companies. They would go to Qualcomm. They would go to ARM, all the big international names. So this is changing, and actually the barriers that were aiming at trying to prevent this catch-up of China are obtaining the opposite, because China is a big country and there is a huge scale effect. So not taking into consideration, so policies that would work for a small country, not necessarily work for a country where every trend is exponential. Everything in China starts very low, and then at some point it explodes. It's just the size, the scale effect of China that does that. Okay. Then the last component on this first long introduction is that how is this all possible? Because there are governance standards on how we connect different things that are very sophisticated. So we often hear in a place where, like the one where I work, developing countries worried that there will be one company setting the standards and shutting everybody else, and they won't be able to join. So the reality is more complex. There are such proprietary standards that are done even to ring fence a market. But the reality is that actually the governance standards that allow then all these 500 producers to work together are a mix of public and private standards, and some are incredibly authoritarian and dictated by one company, but many others are actually really coming from a lot of discussion and consensus. There is a whole industry that works on standards, and actually you can study that because, for instance, the Google Android system publishes all the you can do actually text mining of all the meetings of the basically the 3GPP, which is one of the main associations that governs the standards, and you can see how many people each company sends, what is decided, how each standards is built in, how it's integrated with other standards. There are people that actually are doing that, finding super interesting things by just doing quantitative economics. So for instance, there are some Taiwanese researchers that they found that for instance, super interesting, that manufacturers go to this kind of standard setting associations not because they want to do software, but because they want to be part of that ecosystem to be able to do innovation quicker. And the two producers that are identical in everything, the one that goes through this process of standard setting manages to bring its product to the market 15 months before the other one, which in technology is a lifetime, right? So, and so basically the standards and this interoperability of the standards is what allows technology and innovation in these modern industries. But it also brings attention that we will see again in policy making and in this reglobalization versus deglobalization. So even at the corporation level, basically what happens is that the companies try to standardize their component because they don't want only one buyer. So suppose Apple comes with the next iPhone and it changes the port or the space I have to put the CPU. So it means that basically I have to do whatever I do in a different way, both from a software and from a hardware point of view. So I go through this process to figure out early on what type of investment I need to do, because obviously I need to prepare and I need to be ready at the right time. So I put a lot of people that go to these meetings to help me produce and so this standardization of my product is crucial for compatibility and seamless integration. At the same time, if I'm becoming the monopolist of my one component that is so important on the Apple and Samsung smartphone, what I try to do is to integrate more functions within it and to make it unique, right? To make it harder for others to do the same. And so on the one hand, I try to standardize, to integrate and to open up new markets, but on the other, I try to protect myself. That's exactly, so the companies are doing exactly that. There is this tension that is exactly the same that policymakers try to do, and that brings this tension between deglobalization and reglobalization. And so just to finish, that means that the market structure of this modern industry is very different from what policymakers work with. So traditionally, when policymakers that worry about globalization are sitting not only in trade ministries, they're sitting in finance ministries, they're sitting in defense industries, they're sitting in many other agencies. But so traditionally, they were thinking of the multinational firm only. And so what was the objective function of a multinational firm? To control inputs, to make sure that had access to capabilities or to consumers in profitable markets and to arbitrage costs. So the multinational firm would just open subsidiaries, say, Procter and Gamble now started producing subsidiaries in the entire world, doing the same dishwasher product everywhere with some of that. Then we moved into global value chains, and the strategic objective here was to focus, to specialize on the segment which had the highest value added, outsource first and then offshore what had lower value added, and then integrate it back. And so what I was trying to do, if I were, I would focus on my core function, but the core function was the one that had the strongest value added. These are like the automotive corporations, right? So they keep the design, the engineer, the R&D, and then they have all this complex network of subsidiaries and suppliers that produce the different parts where there is lower value added. And so policymakers today, one of the problems that we have been trying to answer the question of whether we are deglobalizing or reglobalizing is precisely that policymakers are still working a lot with this model. What we are now in, at least for all these new technologies that really matter. So I said the smartphone, but actually the COVID vaccine production was done exactly in the same way, right? A lot of agribusiness products are done like that as well. And so what happens now is that the objective function of the firm is to dominate in a niche in which they're really the best. They don't care about the others. They don't care whether it is the niche that has the highest value added. Why? Because they get profit from scale by doing it for the entire world. So you have concentration of supply and diversification of demand for this one thing that you know how to do. And then a lot of their energy goes into controlling these interconnect standards, which is something that economics completely ignores, and that to me it is going to be central. And so if you really want to explore a field that I think is going to be central but is completely understudied, please go into the interconnect standards economics, how much they matter, how they work, and so on and so forth. And so and so we end up with this picture that looks more like Tetris. I mean, I don't know how many of you know what Tetris is, but it was this old, not the younger ones. But yeah, I call it the Tetris chart. But that's where, so that's where we stay. And so the last question here was like, okay, if I get in this complex system and I try to put barriers towards producers from countries I'm suspicious of for national security, will this market be able to function? So basically, can I extrude China without cost for myself, US companies from this massively modular ecosystem. And so we try to make hypotheses, and we are slowly working through with the numbers, with the analysis. But so we say, okay, you have two options if you are the US policymaker. You can decide to do, like partial barriers or total barriers, right? So if there is partial barriers, you impose to companies to do a partial import substitution. What are the effects? That the costs of doing this increase a lot. So if you think that now that product, which is 5 to 1,000 for the high-end phones, expensive, expect this to become 3,000, 4,000, 5,000. And so part of the inflation that we've seen in the recent years is precisely from this effort to bring frictions into the system. So everything becomes more costly. You might be reshoring one segment, say the CPUs, the semiconductor, but then you will create a spate of new imports. And in fact, one paradox, I will show you something, but there is excellent papers by Davin Chor and Laura Alfaro, which show that actually 5-6 years after the US has imposed tariffs on China, actually they ended importing more from China, but instead of doing it directly, they're doing it indirectly. So you open all these new dependencies you were not suspecting because you're trying to operate in a very complex economy that you only partially understand, and you have oversimplified, and especially you have instruments that are oversimplified to control. So it's like if you are trying to do a microsurgery and you go there with a hammer, right? That's what a bit is happening right now. And then you might be just focusing on the wrong thing. I mean, now it's semiconductors, but there is a lot of innovation, and semiconductors are changing a lot, and some of the new technologies might do away with those. So you have a lot of innovation. So you do not know if you are and you are too slow. So you are always playing catch up. So don't leave the policymaker make this technology decision. If you do full decoupling, the cost of capital might become just higher, obviously, to the point that you might have systemic failure. Some products simply won't be worth producing because they will be too costly. And why they will be too costly? Because you will lose this scale that allowed, this global scale that allowed basically the system to work. Also, you might have, when policy decides on strategic investment, investing on champions, you waste a lot of resources. This is a big problem for smaller and developing countries that have few resources. But basically also for countries that are rich, it means that their technology, their new innovation might be actually much more missing the target because that doesn't have the market test as much as it had before. And if you are the only one to do it and the others still remain open, you have accelerated brain drain. So Brexit has brought an important brain drain to the UK, right? And then, I mean, loss of functionality in general. But what you end up having, it's a lot of this collaborative technological learning across this massively modular system implodes. And you will have even less development, less knowledge diffused, less human capital development. And so some of my colleagues were looking at, for instance, whether we already have signs of what has happened to innovation after the 2018 US-China war. And you see that the patent applications in both countries dropped already. And this sort of parallel stuff that happened in the scientific collaborations between the German bloc and the Allied bloc during the basically in the interwar period, there are a lot of papers on that, but we see some evidence of that as well. So some of the effects I've shown before are happening. And then this is something we have a data set we bought of firm-to-firm linkages. We basically know real time for a lot of firms in the world, who they work with and what type of collaboration they have. And then, through network analysis, we can look at direct and indirect collaborations. And what we saw is that the firms, so we were looking at the number of links that each firm has, and just correlating it with fixed effects, so controlling with fixed effects with other factors. We looked at the firm log sales and at the volatility of the log sales. And in both cases, the firms that had more links were actually growing more, but also being more resilient. And interestingly, as we enter the period of turbulence, 2018, 2022, this difference, this having more links mattered even more. Okay, so now I think let me check. How much time do I have left? Don't say that because I might stay here for the day. Let me know, but I continue. No. Okay. So what motivated these new policies? So first of all, the point is that how did that massive modular system got in place? Because there was a long period, which actually we call the long 90s. So there was a period of expansion of globalization. Then in the mid-80s, the US started worrying a lot about Japan, right? Precisely because it was getting very strong on the digital technologies. And so there was a US-Japan trade war in 1985-87. But then immediately there were negative effects on both countries. The biggest effect of that war was to help Korea break into this industry, because Japan and the US were putting barriers on one another, but they didn't see Korea coming. And there is a famous novel of Tolstoy that has one passage where it says exactly that. No, when you're fighting with someone, be careful, because you are creating spaces for the new to come in, right? And that's exactly what happens also in trade. And so then, if we see from that 1990, the US said, okay, we really need globalization, and we tried to bring some kind of global governance, to export our institutions, our open markets to the world. And they started, signing all these agreements. And the EU construction also expanded and deepened. But you have basically, this is the trade to domestic GDP share for China, the red line, and this is for the rest of the world. And why China? Because China was starting from being very closed and so big that it's worth keeping an eye separately. But if you see, they both were growing a lot. And interestingly, China opened a lot. They grew a lot in this integration, more than the rest of the world. And this is up to the global financial crisis. So there was this long period of expansion, but also the policies were communicated as policies that couldn't be reverted, which brought companies to do investment in fixed costs because they were expecting this ecosystem to continue to work. And then the financial crisis came, and the rest of the world kind of kept its openness to GDP ratio unchanged. But China started shutting, basically trying to do much more within the country. And so in a way, if you want, the big surprise for the Western, but let's say also US policymaker, was that in this first period, China grew too much compared to what they expected, and here didn't open enough. And that started creating in a system that they had built so open, started creating these national security concerns, because they felt that they were being fragile, but that China was highly dynamic in trying, to get more presence in this system without, however, playing the rules of the game they wanted them to play, or to play how they wanted that to play. Okay? So you might ask, was it worthwhile, all these policies of openness? And the answer is a resounding yes. So here, this is a paper with two friends at this point from the Italian Central Bank, and we looked at the first and the second moment of growth. So here we took a solo growth equation, which is the most standard way to measure growth. And we asked, and we put it in a system GEM, Arellano bond, basically. And we looked at whether being involved in traditional trade and global value chain trade plays a role. And what we find is indeed that it's particularly this global value chain trade, so this working together, that has a huge growth effect. You see it here. So there was this high growth and high income convergence. Poverty rates around the world collapsed from 40% to less than 10% in 15 years, right? But what happened, and what we are dealing today with, and what you see a lot of all the policies, are these four worries. Let's say with my colleague Aditya Mattu, we call them the four regrets of globalization. So income inequality, regressiveness, riskiness, what I've been just talking all the time about until now, but also resource degradation. So resource degradation, it's interesting. It has a twist. I will say it in a moment. And then this rivalry for global dominance, right, which is part of what we are seeing. The resource degradation, it's interesting because if you want to preserve and produce most efficiently, globalization is the best tool to do it. But because globalization produces the large scale that we saw here of production and income growth, and so pushes consumption as well, so we all consume much more than we consumed 30 years ago, then it contributes to resource degradation, to the point that some reports say that we will run out of some essential materials by 2060, that we would need to basically go to other planets to get some of the mineral resources we are overusing, to the point that all the back and forth of these parts and components when they are manufactured are polluting. And this new digital economy of machine learning, artificial intelligence, as we know, it's very energy demanding, right? So we have this double twist. If you want this level of consumption and growth that the world has experienced, the best and most efficient and most environmentally friendly way to do it is globalization. But because it generates this exponential growth, which actually allows globalization to have sense, then you also end up with a lot of degradation. How we solve this? I don't know. We haven't solved it yet, right? But so the four regrets of globalization, quickly. Regressiveness. These are like the data from Piketty, the world inequality database, which it's great to play with. And so here simply what I did was to take the G20 countries, and I'll explain in a minute why I focused on the G20. But if you take the G20 countries, so basically what was the income share of the bottom 50%, which is the blue dots in 1990, compared to 2020, what was the share for the top 1% or the top 10%? And what you see is that the top 1% and 10%, they had a smaller share of the cake in 1990 than today, and the bottom 1% in each country, in all the G20, developed and developing, had a bigger share of the cake. So we have much more inequality, right? And then here you say, okay, what about the other countries? And you see precisely the same trend for a lot of countries. For some countries, not, but there are important, in particular, for the fact that the bottom 50% lost out of this period their share of the cake, so they didn't partake in the growth in their domestic economy as much as the richest part of the population. Then the environmental degradation. So if you correlate, this is the story I was telling you before, if you just simply correlate trade openness with CO2 footprint, which is how much we consume per capita, and the material footprint is how much of these virgin materials we consume, you see that they are highly correlated. If you put it in a proper regression, you find out that this correlation, it's all driven by this growth of GDP growth, basically. Another interesting twist of globalization is that while the domestic emissions in the OECD countries dropped substantially, so all our countries are much cleaner, as consumer, we're actually contributing globally to more pollution through outsourcing the pollution. So we outsource, it's called leakage, or pollution heaven effect, or, there are different definitions for different aspects of this problem, but basically we all contribute to pollute more, even if we behave as consumer and producers locally in a clean manner. And this is what measures like the Green Deal and the CBAM that the EU is trying to put in place wants to try to control through fiscal policies, but that's another story. Then what I showed you for the smartphone industry is true in general. So we have this increasing concentration of the global economy. When you go at the product level, HS6, you see in every country of the world an increase in concentration on the top 1% exporters, top 1% importer. So there are nuances for different type of countries, but this is a global trend. Every single individual product is simply done by less firms, which creates more global interdependence. Finally, the rivalry. So this is what I was also mentioning before. The US worried about China. This is a network of the global trade in 2015. I don't need to explain probably to this audience how a network works, but obviously the largest bubbles are the most central, and even the positioning in the network reflects, this reflects the georeferencing, but the size reflects the importance directly and indirectly of products from that country, of exports from that country for the global economy. And the thickness of the lines reflects also the importance of the bilateral trade flows. And so if you see, this was 2015 when the US started changing policy stance. They were really worried about the centrality of China. What happens after that? China is more central. The US is, importance as rank, which is this idea that when you deal with scale plus barriers, you might end up with unintended consequences. And so the new policy stance then, so there are data sets that, this is actually an area where we need much more work. We need to, and quantitative scientists, data scientists to gather much more information about all these new barriers. But one very imperfect thing that we have since the global crisis is this Global Trade Alert database developed by Professor Simon Ivanet at the University of St. Gallen. And so we took those data and we just put it through a formal test for structural breaks. And we see indeed that there is a change in protectionist attitude in 2009, but that doesn't count because the data set started only in 2008. But again, in 2015, even it doesn't seem too visible here, but statistically it shows up as a tide change, and then again in 2019. So clearly there are these big moments in which something has changed in policies. And so then we looked describing some of these new policies. What we see is the number of new restrictions, as you see, increased. I mean, this is the pandemic, right? But after the pandemic didn't really come away, those restrictions are there, they stayed. But you see the jump is spectacular in the number of new restrictions that have been imposed. And if we ask what type of restrictions are those, export barriers went a bit up, import barriers came down, and that has to do with that massive modularity. I need to be able to get the inputs, the critical inputs, even better now that there is a less consensual global economy. But the industrial policy is what really increased. So a lot of these new barriers are coming from, investing in industrial policy and really figuring out how to track industrial policy subsidies. It's really, really important now, and we need new data. We don't have enough data, so Then what we did in this paper, which we just put out as a working paper, is that we started looking. This was the motivating chart for the paper. So if you basically basic regression to control for some fixed effect factors. But then if you correlate GDP per capita and the number of measures in 2003 from this new industrial policy database, which is an evolution of that global trade alert, what you see is that, of course, there is a correlation with GDP per capita. Richer countries are able to put in place more subsidies. That's what it's saying. But even controlling for that, you see that is really the G20 that are putting in place more subsidies. And these other countries, smaller countries or poorer countries, are just not able to catch up. And that's actually something worrisome, because it's a world where the bigger, command, distort the system. This, we never had it before. We had that the most important economies were trying to create a level play field to some extent, with exceptions, but they were creating, and then, the distortions were coming from smaller guys that were trying to do infant industry policies. Now, actually, the ones that are mostly distorting are the G20. And those are the ones that can do damage, to all these others that can't keep up. So the inequality, I think, between countries will increase. And then we looked, one objection could be, you're focusing on restrictive policies, but what about the liberalizing policies? And if you see, the liberalizing interventions also have increased, but to almost one smaller order of magnitude. So the restrictive intervention went up 8 times. Here we are talking about a range of 1%, 1.5%. And here there is just some description of what type of concretely policies have been used. And this include like financial grants, state loans, guarantees, subsidies, and so on and so forth. Okay, we map it here, the red measures versus green measure, and we see that, again, most of the action is the US, China. The EU is less easy to see because I left it as individual countries. If you put them together, they also are a main actor. And, okay, then there is something about climate change, which I will jump, but the other big motivation is to clean the environment. And so another database that we've been trying to put together, not with text mining or artificial intelligence or machine learning, but actually with real lawyers collecting information, was how much climate-related policies that have been put in place from 1990 to 2023 include distortions to trade. Then basically what we find is that they do increasingly In fact, they increasingly talk about worries about competitiveness and competition with other countries. They are increasingly so the climate basically agenda is increasingly being used for rivalry. That's the point of all these charts that I won't go through, particularly by the EU. And then another thing that for now we know very little, but I think it will be important to watch over in the coming years, is that since 2022, there is this new generation of very murky agreements that for a moment they don't have teeth. But they could be potentially damaging. Are memoranda of understanding. The problem of this memoranda of understanding that are not part of the system of rules of the global trade. So we don't know really what the parties are signing up to, but it's basically to get critical minerals from African countries. So, for instance, the US DRC Zambia agreement, and they are almost exclusive rights to get some critical minerals from places that have a lot of critical minerals for the technologies that are needed for the green transition, for the digital economy, and for those two main industries, right? And the problem of this is that they offer prospects of strategic partnerships, but then they leave it to the private sector to develop a domestic industry. At the same time, the poor country involved is sort of signing up to give exclusive use to the G20 country that they are agreeing with of their critical resources. And that can be a huge source of tensions. That's why I think it's important to watch. So global trade responses, and here I want to accelerate a bit, I can say it in one word, is that so we see some reallocation of trade patterns. So this is after the US-China war. We see that actually there has been a pickup in trade with initially with ASEAN at the expenses of China. But more recently, it's really Mexico, and ASEAN came down, too integrated with China, basically. But by and large, basically, trade is holding up well for now. And there are two possible explanations. One is that this system of trade is so complex that these policy measures miss the mark, and it's very resilient. But then the question to ask and to analyze in the coming years is, as the number, frequency, and size of distortions increase, when we will see dynamic effects, non-linearities, and an implosion, a step change at some point? And that's an open question. The second possibility is that we are simply, because this industrial policy is politically motivated, so not on the basis of economic, we are creating a range of new links that are politically motivated before we undo the links that we think are risky for us. And if we do that, we will see a moment of growth in trade, but then again, we will see the moment of implosion when they undo the old risky links. So that's, we will see, but for now, trade has held up well. However, this is not a source of comfort. I think it's a temporary effect. And this is what I already said, that China became more central. And so finally, the effects for bystanders. The effects I'm not going to say, but the bottom line on the effects is just that the old fundamentals still matter. Basically the ones that are gaining from this new changed landscapes are the ones that are able to efficiently allocate resources across uses. And these are different aspects that matter. But let me finish with the response option for the smaller countries. So in the paper, this paper that we just put out as working paper, what we find is that if you are one of those non-G20 countries, you have a negative effect from the industrial policies in G20 countries, except if you are in a deep agreement with them. In that case, you actually end up gaining, because you have these deep linkages that allow you to benefit from the subsidies that your partner put in place. Some countries like Indonesia are super interesting to look at, because what they decided to do is, okay, we have all these distortions from the G20, but I'm very rich in nickel, and nickel it's a product that is super important in this new economy. Then what I do is I put an export ban on nickel, and whoever wants my nickel needs to process it here and then export it. And so what did they do? They ended up actually nickel and even cobalt, right? They immediately went to zero in 2020, in the 2014 when they passed this, and they were successful in launching an export of iron and steel, which are the derivatives of nickel. Now, however, if you look further, all this is still subsidized by the state. So we don't know whether it will hold the market test. But this is how some of the large developing countries are responding. Others are simply hurting themselves. Sri Lanka put an import ban on fertilizers, except that didn't realize that fertilizers were super important for an agricultural economy like theirs. And so they actually wanted to do it for macroeconomic purposes. They ended up ruining their macroeconomy even more, because it's true that they reduced imports, and in this way they thought they could improve their balance of payment. But because actually the damage on the agricultural products was large and extended, even if the ban lasted only 4 months, they ended up actually having even a worsening of the balance of payments. And so bottom line is that a lot of the smaller and poorer countries don't really have much choice but to use measures that are really detrimental to themselves. They are left with NTMs, non-tariff measures that are murky, are difficult to undo. They create a lot of domestic champions, and they actually perpetrate international tensions. If you add to that the WTO is paralyzed in one of its core functions, which is the appellate body, which is the one that is supposed to even out problems between countries, we actually are sort of charging, it's a bomb that expects to be exploded if we don't find a solution. So, the WTO needs to start refunctioning, and a system of global rules needs to be adhered to. But what we have is that the G20 are now the ones that are breaking with those rules. And that's a highly volatile environment and very dangerous, right? And so what is this brave new world? We don't know. So if you ask me what's the answer to deglobalization versus reglobalization, I will say certainly globalization is changing its shape, is becoming more controlled by few corporations, so it's more corporate. It has the seeds to be more unequal that we have seen until when we don't find a new system of rules. However, where we'll end up is very difficult because there are these different tensions. On the one hand, the economy and the economy that really matters is so global, so interdependent, that maybe at some point we will realize that we need to work with each other, and we need to find some accommodation. So we can't have wars between two giants or, use everything for the short-term gain. Or, and those are the agglomeration tendencies, so the complexity, the market concentration. The best way to control your enemy is to include him in your decision, right? So that's what I was saying with China. The geographic clustering, because if we need to innovate at a rapid pace, and we need to innovate at the rapid pace, at least for the climate change emergency, we need the clustering, and then we need common rules with that. Or there are also these dispersion tendencies. We have too much scale in a few places. We want to slow down my enemy, economic enemy, even if... so basically, I want to damage it knowing that by damaging it, I will damage my economy as well. But if he gets out more damage than me, I will still have won, because this is about hegemonic control, power, influence I have on the global economy. So there is some element of that we don't know where it will go. Then the market fragmentation and so on. And so where we will end up, it's difficult. In the short run, I think we will keep seeing that the same actors that are distorting the market, be that countries or firms, are also doing things to try to integrate the market. And so this schizophrenic and very volatile environment, I think, is there to stay for a while. Okay, sorry. Thank you. I'm done. Questions or I don't. I'm moderating myself, or I can go.
So, thank you for the lecture. I have the first question, if you don't have any. So, but I would like to give you the opportunity to ask first. But if not, I will take the advantage of being the moderator, and I will give you the first one. So, any hands up? No hands up? So, oh, yes. Okay, Jose Maria has one.
Well, thank you very much for Daria for this impressive presentation. The quantity of information we have received is is enormous. I'm not an expert unfortunately, in this topic. So I think that I'm going to ask you a question that it is very easy to ask. Maybe it's very difficult to give an answer, no? But I pay attention to one of your pictures that was about the level of production or the level of development and environmental damage. And the easy question to ask is, where is the equilibrium? Where is the trade-off? Because in the end, industry development needs consumption and needs energy, needs some degradation of the resources, not? But where we can put in terms of globalization an equilibrium point. And the second, and I want to take also advantage of having you here to ask you another easy question to ask and difficult to respond. Next year in University of Alcalá, we are thinking of organize a conference of something like zero hunger economics. And in this topic, one of the key words could be GMOs, genetically modified organisms. When we proposed this topic, some people said, "Oh, okay, it's not a good idea because maybe some companies, some countries will collect all the power of the market, and then the world population will be in hands of that companies." I only wanted to know your opinion about that, about if you think this is possible, in maybe that could be contribute to a new graphic where China or other countries have a more centrality in the graphics or something like that. Only your opinion. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So you have two questions, two difficult ones. So you can choose which one you would like to start.
Okay, so on what's the sweet spot between level of production and environmental damage, I think that the first best that it's being tried is to pricing in the externalities, and so a lot is both for local pollutants and global pollutants, a lot is going through that. How we do it, I think we don't know the economics very well yet. So I'll make you an example. There is an economist, Emmanuel Fari, that unfortunately committed suicide in 2020. Otherwise, he would have been probably, I think, at the level of Keynes, because he was just 40, and in his young age, he changed the perspective of how we think about things in so many areas that I think he was, on a path where. But anyway, one of the things that he managed to do in earlier years was precisely to think about fiscal policies, right? And so, for even reflecting, he was French, and so he was reflecting about the protest of the Gilets jaunes some years ago, when Macron had put a tax on oil, and basically all the commuters, the lower population, which is the big critique with Macron, that he doesn't think about, he thinks of the bobo of Paris, but he doesn't think of the workers that have to drive every day and so on. And he made a point that we had, as economists, always a dogma on quantitative restrictions, but to induce certain changes without creating backlash like that, we might have really think outside the box. And in this case, in a beautiful paper, he demonstrated that actually the quantitative restrictions are superior to this pricing in for that particular problem. And so what I really do think is, so he was a mathematician, physicist by background, and even there he was innovating a lot, is that I think we don't have the answer, but the answer comes exactly in spaces like this that try to put these different disciplines together and think outside the box. What I know is that the economic disciplines is very beautiful because it has tools to simplify the world. And that's a powerful instrument, right? And that's what attracted me to economics for a start. But it's also extremely limited. And I feel really this claustrophobia of the economic discipline, that we have just very, very rough tools for answering some of the challenges of our days. The second one goes into these challenges, right? It's huge, but definitely competition policy. And that's why, so for me, an interesting question of which competition policy is a sub-factor is how does democracy come into the picture in all this, right? And so democracy, it's also about the level play field, about keeping market contestability, no? And so do we need, how do we control, the entire NASA program is in the US is now in the hands of two companies. So the US government has completely given all the most important innovation in the hands of two companies. So we are seeing in many fields, and that's the case in many other fields, right? And so, of course, these corporations, if then they build business models on that privilege, will be difficult to convince them to do away with. And I think we conceptually, philosophically, we don't know how to navigate that contradiction. So this is a moment more important than ever. I mean, really, to the next generation, I think we have a lot of questions, and we know some of what doesn't work. On many other cases, we still have to find out. Things we believed work, we genuinely believe work, and then we discover we are creating monsters. But we don't know what works, and that's really, to the new generation. We need the new ways of thinking and putting together different disciplines. So that's why I was actually very happy to come to this conference, because I think this is a space that can create that. Okay. You have one question? Yes. We can share the microphone.
Thank you, Professor Daria, for your intervention. I have a question to put to you about a term, a concept used by the IMF after the crisis of 2008. And the concept is slowbalization. Slowbalization. Well, the first paper of the IMF talks about this concept, and I would like to hear from you if the globalization concept fixed in between globalization and deglobalization, because the last numbers of the UNCTAD, United Nations for Trade and Development, we can see that there is a very globalization and deglobalization are too close, not a disparity, but close. Is the slow globalization something that we would like to hear from you? Could balance two extremes?
Okay, so first of all, there are two aspects to that. The first is that what you really need to look at is this elasticity of trade to GDP, right? That's the measure. And the one of this globalization that it's compared to was this long 90s, which was a period of exceptionally high elasticity because it was the period of outsourcing and offshoring. Companies were learning to organize better processes within the company. So in the 80s, you didn't have an HR department divided, everybody was doing a bit everything. And then there was a big revolution within the companies in the 80s where they rationalized the organization of the firm that allowed to outsource, to know how much different departments were doing outsourcing. The moment you outsourced, it was easy to then do it across borders. And what we've seen in manufacturing, this long 90s was this exceptional trade to GDP elasticity that was the result of that process of trying to cut costs under the pressure of financial markets that wanted all these large corporations to have very lean balance sheets. Now, a different revolution is happening because I think we need to go always back to the firm. That's why I started with the firm. We need to think about the firm and then, we can see what happens in aggregate. The other revolution is that we are incorporating digital tools in every and each area of the economy. These digital tools, again, are bringing some transaction cost very low, and we are learning to do it within the corporation. Remote working has been a huge learning accelerated by the pandemic. But once you learn to do it with your own workers of your own town, again, that's easy to do globally unless you put policy distortions. And that brings me, first is that this globalization they were referring to, I think it's precisely this problem with economics, looking myopically at some measures, which, because the economy is changing, don't reflect anymore the majority of the economy or the most dynamic part, but it's outside that. And hence, a lot of globalization is happening in services. One of the slides where I went very quick was showing that actually in services, trade is, exactly for different reasons. And this teleworking, this telemigrants, that's really a big phenomenon. Whether that will be a sustained phenomenon, I don't know. It's too early to say. But definitely that's part of globalization. The fact that we all interact through these global platforms, that's globalization. The flow of ideas, which is what makes a modern economy, has never been as rich as now. It's just that we are not yet able to quantify all the value added. We don't know anymore with artificial intelligence how to calculate, with open source system, which nationality is the value added. Android sits on a lot of the open source of Oracle, no? How much of the revenues generated? There was a case in the US that went up to the Supreme Court to try to clarify that. How much of that is US value added or of a US corporation, and how much it's open source? And then completely a-national because you don't know who has contributed, right? So that's where I was saying. So yes, we see some globalization, but it's because for a long time we were looking at the manufacturing as the big game in town. I think this is fundamentally changing. Digital technologies have a lot to do with that, and we need to measure again. This is another area where we need to measure better this, and again come with new concepts of what we mean by globalization. And globalization is multidimensional. So that's.
I think that do you want to ask anything? Yes. Another.
Jose Ramon, are you speaking first? If not, okay, I will go ahead and ask a methodological question. And this is a nice connection with stuff I want to talk about later today. I noticed a couple of your studies toward the end identified fixed effects, and I was wondering if you had applied other data science methods. In particular, I have two in mind, and if you've done it, then that's great, and I'd love to hear how you and your colleagues at the World Bank have accomplished this goal. And if not, I'll think about it further because it's part of my own presentation. It occurs to me that fixed effects, as a methodological matter, can also be quantified through the clustering of your data series. As long as the data series are labeled by country, which for international economic diplomacy is very important, I wonder if you have undertaken or attempted any clustering methods. Second is a little bit more sophisticated, but it's technically not unrelated, and it's the Gaussian mixture model. And the idea there is not just to use the clustering, which is purely unsupervised, but also to add a little bit of expert analysis to say these are the clusters of countries moving in a particular way, and the distribution of the outputs as well as the inputs will look different across multiple dimensions. So I asked those two questions, and if the answer is you haven't done them, I would love to talk to you about offline more in greater detail, but I would love to know what data science tools such as clustering and Gaussian mixtures that you have used at the World Bank.
Yeah. So yes, clustering. I mean, it's customarily done in this type of analysis. I mean, in general, we work a lot at this point with the difference in difference methods for this type of approaches and staggered difference in difference. And now there are a lot of economists that are trying to apply that to different econometric methodologies that were used, like the gravity model. And so there is a lot of innovation there, but there is also a lot of space for coming up with new ideas. So it's definitely something we are trying to invest in, and I'm all ears about what we can do differently econometrically as well. Yeah.
First of all, thank you very much for a so interesting and wonderful presentation. I have two probably simple question, and I don't know if simple answers. One is about the first part of your presentation regarding the iPhone, the smartphone market. The question is, you was mentioned about the fragmentation of the market and the components, and then came to my mind the fact that we have this discussion about the chips in Europe versus China and Taiwan and US. What do you think about this situation that is obviously the most important part, not only for the smartphones, but for all these other electronic components that we need to do? And Europe was totally out of the market regarding the chip and now they are starting things because NVIDIA and Intel has taken this market, big market. What do you think about that?
So I think that's really a very complex area. And right now, I don't think I have a lot of elements. What we saw in the context of this. So first of all, semiconductors. It's like saying machinery, right? So they're very specialized, and so one first thing is to understand what slice of semiconductors we really care about. There is a lot of innovation in the type of materials you use for this superconductive force ability, but also in the way you integrate increasingly, it's a system on a chip or, mechanical parts that then become, and there's been a lot of innovation that was precisely, in fact, that's actually, it's funny, but it's the follow-up paper that we are trying to dent in, but we see that a lot of this massive modularity that we saw, that it's, exponential. And NVIDIA, that's the classical example. It was an industry on the side, a complementer, that suddenly figure out a way to do things completely different, and now they completely disrupted the market. But this is this massive modularity. In artificial intelligence, there is this cheap French company, right, that has managed to do the stuff that OpenAI does for a fraction of their and they skyrocketed and so on. And I think that's really the type of innovation we need for the problems we have, and the microchip is certainly one part of that. But I think, I think it's too early to have opinions. We can only observe what's happening because because it's happening fast and it's happening from many different directions. And
And the second question is regarding the Jose Maria mentioned about the GMOs, because how do you think about the limits that are imposed by some countries about the GMOs, especially in South Asia, like Philippines, Sri Lanka, etc.? Because this is to impose this kind of limits, it goes against the science, because the science has demonstrated, in the case, for example, of the golden rice, that is the most clear example of something that could save the life of people. In fact, you know that 150 Nobel laureates have signed a declaration to support these GMOs for avoid the situation of hunger that these countries are suffering. What do you think as a technical advisor of an international organization about these kind of situations?
So it's funny, but I think I'm in that phase of life when you start becoming very philosophical. And what I think is more than technical advice, we need really, it goes back to what type of world we want, right? And so in a way, we created a world that is very integrated. And I think the new generations don't realize how integrated it is. But we still have national rules, right? And so I think it's up to humanity to decide how much we want to stay with national rules because we don't want cultures to convert, and how much we are willing to give up sovereignty to have global rules to all live peacefully. But that requires to be ready to change ourselves. It cannot be only imposing our rules, which is what we're trying to do now. The G20 are, in a way, trying to do the first. And so I think what, your question require a philosophical answer, no? Like on deciding what humanity is supposed to become. And based on that, we will find solutions. There are proposals on the table. They say that we need, for instance, there is a minor UN agency. It's called the International Trade Center, which is a joint venture between UNCTAD and the WTO. And there is this reform talks around the WTO. There is a document that is called the Villar Protocol, because it was written in this little mountain resort of Villar. And it says that we should transform that particular agency into a global organization of standards, no? And that would be exactly the type of institution that could resolve, how much individual countries are supposed to be free to decide their own things. But if we go there, we need to do it in not by imposition, but by conviction, right? And that's where we go back to the answer is philosophical at the end of the day.
Thank you.
So I think that we have another one, but I think it is very short. Okay, I don't know. Jose Maria, can we allow this last question? Okay, it's short. Okay.
We were wondering about this composition. Where is the source of this image? Why you have chosen this image for your final?
From DALE, ChatGPT image producer.
So, but what did you place?
I said I want a picture that shows this tension, in the debate around globalization, and the tension is between, this need to, basically the first part of my presentation, and the second is, all the concerns about, inequality, make it, ambiguous and a bit, and that's, I tried economic growth up there. I tried to, a few iterations, giving a few more examples, and that's what came up with.
Thank you very much.
So thank you, Daria. Thank you for your presentation. The concepts are quite difficult, but I think the explanation and the way in which you show these ideas has been very easy to follow. So thank you for your clarity and for your time. And of course, we will be here to have more time to discuss later. Thank you very much.
1819, and it dates from it's dated between the 4th and 5th century before Christ, and is in Spanish is of course very well known, worldwide known. So it's for you as a as a souvenir. It's very lovely, okay. So it's a way to say thank you.